If you're romanticizing a particular struggle that you went through and you're trying to support, quote unquote, someone else, and you're saying it's not that hard, get over it, that person might be in the middle of an emotional crisis. In fact, they might be coming to you for that kind of support, especially if they know that you've gone through it. My name is Damon Brown of DamonBrown.net. My main thing is helping you as a side hustler, a solopreneur, or otherwise a non-traditional entrepreneur. If you're enjoying this content, be sure to subscribe for free. I'm coming to you every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, Vegas time. Today we're going to talk about gold-plated grit. It sounds very romantic. It sounds like something you might give someone if you wanted to marry them, like a wedding ring or engagement ring. It's actually not that cute. It comes from Brene Brown, the queen of emotional intelligence. Be sure and check out the playlist that I have with a lot of discussions about Brene Brown and the work that she does. Now, what she talks about with a gold-plated grit is with us looking back at something that we went through, something that was a really big hardship in our life. And then when we look back on it, particularly when we're talking to other people, we romanticize it in a way where it wasn't that hard. For instance, I had a colleague who was talking to someone who they were coaching. And the person who they were coaching was saying, oh my gosh, I'm having such a hard time. I'm struggling with fear, I'm struggling with challenges and all these things. And my colleague said, well, I actually don't worry about fear. I don't worry about that stuff because I'm beyond that. How does that make you feel? It did not make me feel good. And luckily there's some commentary from other folks that helped point out how the coach was in the wrong. In other words, the coach was saying, I'm better than you. There's more insight that I have than you have, and therefore I don't have the same feelings that you have. It was not from a level of empathy or sympathy. But unfortunately, we go through this gold-plated grit every single day. We have instances where we go through a tough time and we're like, yeah, I got through it. Why don't you get through it? But the person might be in the middle of the muck. They might be going through some challenging times. They might not have the same resources or frankly strengths that you do. And you might have forgotten some of the struggles that you had at the time. So this gold-plated grit can be really dangerous when it comes to what Brene Brown specializes in, which is emotional intelligence. And it could hurt your relationships, whether it's your business relationships, your personal relationships, your intimacy, all these different things. So we're gonna break down 2 reasons why you wanna try to avoid this gold-plated grit. The first problem with gold-plated grit is that it doesn't actually give room for growth. And the only thing it really brings is a sense of shame. If you're romanticizing a particular struggle that you went through and you're trying to support, quote unquote, someone else, and you're saying it's not that hard, get over it, that person might be in the middle of an emotional crisis. In fact, they might be coming to you for that kind of support, especially if they know that you've gone through it. I was going through a hard time, and there was a family member I confided in and said, hey, it's having a really tough time. And they said, hey, I've been through that before too. The best thing you can do is get over it and move on. The best thing you can do is get over it and move on. I've coached hundreds of people, and now when I think about that moment, I cringe. But I was cringing also at that time too, even though I didn't have some of the wisdom that I have now from working with different people such as yourself. That invalidates someone else's feelings. Now, I'm positive that my relative believed that they were helping me be strong and move on. But that has to do with their processing. And they might have been struggling at the time when they were having that same challenge that I was having at the time. But there was no sense of empathy. Empathy is you stepping into someone else's shoes and respecting whatever they might be feeling at the moment, even if you'd have a different reaction. That's what empathy is. Sympathy is when you've gone through the same thing and you can relate to what the other person's going through. In the case of this, it was both. They could relate to what I was going through and they could step in my shoes and be empathetic about it as well. But they chose not to. Secondly, when it comes to gold-plated grit, you end up becoming a prison. You, who are doing the judging, you end up becoming a prison to whatever area you're not willing to face. For instance, if you're saying that you went through a divorce, or you went through a death, or you went through some serious financial stuff, all these things that are kind of part of life as you become an adult, breakups and financial ups and downs and all those things that happen. If you went through that and you look back at it and you romanticize it, you're not actually extracting the lessons that come from it. I think about the painful stuff that I talk about, particularly in my book, Bring Your Worth, which is actually included in the new book, Built From Now, the deluxe edition of that. But the original one is Bring Your Worth, Level Up Your Creative Power, Value, and Service to the World. It's still available, but you can get it in the deluxe edition of Built From Now. It's included in there. Thanks for all of y'all who have supported the new book. As I talk about in Bring Your Worth, I talk about these challenges that I had financially, emotionally, some of the losses that I had. It's a very vulnerable book for me. If I wasn't willing to admit that I lost footing sometimes, that I had challenges, that despite me having a master's in magazine publishing and doing 4 TED Talks and having best-selling books and having a wonderful family, that I still have all these challenges and all this darkness that I'm having to process. If I wasn't willing to have that conversation, at least in my case, this book wouldn't exist. Definitely Built From Now wouldn't exist either, the new book. Those discussions allowed me to connect with you. But most importantly, which is what I'm getting at, even if you're not a coach, even if you're not an author, even if you're not a TED speaker, it doesn't matter. You have to have that relationship with yourself. You have to have that relationship with yourself. As I mentioned in the first point, as far as judging other people, when we have gold-plated grit, we're actually judging ourselves. Talking to a colleague recently, and we're talking about partnerships. And I've had a lot of partnerships that haven't worked out that well. I've actually done a video about it recently about how to co-found things and what kind of co-author or co-agreements. There's so many co-founderships, co-authorships, which I've done. It's about some of the books over here that you can see. Business partnerships behind the scenes. So a lot of the passive income that I have, it's actually with some of my friends, some of my colleagues, and other folks who I've done a partnership with, and we end up splitting the profits, etc. I've done a recent video about this, and where I go a lot deeper. But when I was talking to my colleague about partnerships that have quote unquote failed or didn't go the way that we wanted to, what we talked about is how we have to get our part in the role. We have to understand our part in it. There is a level of shame. And with Brene Brown, she defines guilt as you having an internal metric. As I talk about in my TED Talk, why you should strive to do good enough, which I'll throw a link into here too. Back in 2018 over at TEDx Toledo, guilt is about having an internal metric where you feel as though you should do something, but you're not. You feel guilty about it. Shame has to do with how you believe other people are judging you. Not how they're actually judging you, but how you believe they're judging you. Imagine that, but that has to do with your relationship with yourself. So if you have a partnership that goes sour, that goes the wrong way, that goes in the direction that you don't feel good about, you might feel guilt about the decisions that you made with it. But shame has to do with how other people will judge you. If you're pointing at other people and saying, this partnership went sour, they did something wrong, you're not taking ownership of your part. Your part is that you chose them as a partner. Your part is that you signed the dotted line with them. Your part is that you married them. Whatever the case may be, you have a part in that. If we get into this game of gold-plated grit, and again, gold-plated grit is us going through a rough time where we just might have eked our way by, and then we made it through, and then we see someone else going through it, and we tell them it's not a big deal. That's gold-plated grit. When we play that game that Brene Brown talks about, we end up not owning our part in those things that failed. Using the words that you might use, not me. If you feel as though something failed, something was a mistake, you're part of that decision. When we don't address those things, then we carry shame. We're afraid of being found out. And that's the biggest problem I found with gold-plated grit when I've coached people, even with my own BS, is that when you don't admit how tough of a time you had or how vulnerable you were at that moment where you were struggling, then you're afraid of being found out. That's where the shame comes from. That's where it gets nerve-wracking. That's where you're not sure if you're gonna make it or not. So number one, you really want to be thoughtful about how you view and interpret the things of your past, particularly when they come up with other people. And if you're trying to tell someone to get over it, the worst thing you can do is tell them to get over it. Because the only thing that can come from that is judgment and shame from their part. And the second thing, when you play the game of gold-plated grit, the only thing that can happen is that you end up getting shame about being found out that you actually were struggling. But that's a discussion that you need to have with yourself. If you want more insight about Brene Brown and emotional intelligence, I have a whole swath, I think that's the word, catalog smorgasbord, cornucopia of videos that are under my playlist of Brene Brown and Smart Emotional Intelligence. I'll throw a link in here. Be sure to subscribe for free. It's at youtube.com/BrownDamon. I come to you every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, Vegas time. And until next time, work on your emotional intelligence. I sure as heck am. Remember that you can always bring your worth and that you can always build from now. Take care.